Awesome. Thank you all for joining tonight. Um, we have author JP Barnett with us. I'm going to launch pretty much right on in unless do you want to give a quick intro to yourself, sir?
Sure. My name is JP Barnett. You already hit that. I am an author of technically horror novels, horror thriller novels. They're also, I think, filed under action adventure on Amazon. And I've been doing it for 3 years now, a little over 3 years. And I spent the rest of my life as a software, well, not the rest of my life, but the rest of my adult life as a software engineer, and just always wanted to write. So then I decided to go after it full force, and here I am.
Awesome. So I'm going to launch into the questions. And if y'all have questions, feel free to pop in. Keep yourself muted unless you are speaking because we get a lot of background noise otherwise. But feel free to pop in with questions and unmute yourself. So I'm going to hop in. Your author profile, which is the first thing I went for questions, mentions that your first story ever was about a tiger cub saving the military. Tell us about that and how that, as you say, started you off on the path to this career.
Yeah, so actually it like many things for boys, I guess, it started with a girl. I really wanted to impress a girl, and that girl was our student teacher, Miss Sparrow. I had the hugest crush on her in second grade. And in the assignment, I think they had little laminated pictures, and I don't remember if I got assigned it or if I got to pick, but I ended up with a tiger cub. So I had to write a story about a tiger cub. And we wrote it by hand on those like really thin pieces of paper with the lines that we practiced our handwriting on. So it couldn't have possibly been very long. But I can sum it up. The military was fighting a bad guy, and they had a laser that would kill only people, but it wouldn't hurt other people. So the tiger jumped in front of the laser and saved all of the military, and that was pretty much the whole thing. And I had so much fun doing that I remember it, and I can't say I remember any other assignment from second grade. Most of us probably don't. So that was the beginning of a whole lifetime of writing. In middle school, I filled 3 spiral notebooks with 2 novels that I wrote that were parodies of Star Trek: The Next Generation. I still have those around here somewhere. I can barely read them because I wrote them in pencil. And then around middle school, my mom actually got me a typewriter that took a floppy disk. It was super fancy. So it had a line, it had like a single line where you could type and you could save it to the floppy disk and use the typewriter as a printer, basically. And I wrote a whole other novel on that I still have. And I was just writing for fun was something I did my whole life. When it came time to go to college, I don't really think I knew that being an author was an actual option. So it wasn't anything I ever considered. So I went into software engineering instead.
I'm fairly sure software engineering was probably a little more profitable at the beginning.
It was.
Not that I have anything against authors, but I'm married to one. I know what the budget looks like. So at what point did you get into horror? Because I have indeed met second graders who read Stephen King, but not many.
I wasn't a second grader who read Stephen King, but I might have been a second grader who tried. My mom is a huge Stephen King fan. She has, I'm sure to this day, I haven't checked her bookshelves, but I'm sure they're all lined up on a bookshelf. And so there's more than one occasion that I would start a Stephen King novel and she would read ahead of me and take it away from me because I was too young to read it. And that happened many times. I actually remember getting into horror as far as literature goes, not movies, but books was actually Dean Koontz was the first one I remember reading to completion. His Watchers, which I think was one of his first books, was a book that I really enjoyed. And I really hit full stride with an author that I think a lot of people don't think of as horror, and that is Michael Crichton. He's one of my favorite novelists. And I think he was amazing at tying science fiction in with adventure and horror. And that's something that I really try to bring into my books. I want them to be fun and not like dour. And I think he did a good job of that. And really, so he's probably my biggest influence as far as like the kinds of books I want to write.
Awesome. So that shaped your style. Is there anyone who pops out when you think of your prose or um your storytelling kind of method?
Yeah, that's a good question. I thought about this a little bit, and I actually work hard to have my own voice because you don't want to rip someone off. But there are so many authors that I definitely admire that are active currently. And one of those that I can't wait to write a book more in his style is Blake Crouch. So he wrote a book called Dark Matter and another one called Recursion, and they're these kind of sci-fi thrillers. And he writes in present tense, and there's so much momentum, and I really love that about his prose. Like you can't slow down because you're running the whole time. And I love that about him. I also really like Ernest Cline. So he wrote Ready Player One, and I think his writing style is so approachable. I think that that's something that I try to do with my writing as well. That you kind of feel, I'm not gonna bore you with a lot of details, and I'm not gonna hit you with big words. Like I want it to be something you can get through quickly and digest easily. So I appreciate about his writing. And then I kind of like the whims. My books aren't super whimsical, but I am impressed with authors who can do that well, like Robin Sloan, who wrote Sourdough and Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore, and another author, T. Kingfisher. She had a horror book called The Twisted Ones, which won some awards recently, and I just adored that book. It was awesome.
Awesome. Um, what do you feel draws you to horror, and then what do you feel draws audiences to horror? Like,
Yeah. So I think that me being drawn to horror originally was kind of that's just what I grew. That's what my mom read, and that's what I was uh, most exposed to. But I still enjoy horror because for a few reasons. I think especially horror thrillers, which are kind of where mine fit. They're so fast to read. I like to escape. I like to feel like a movie. Like it takes me 3 4 hours. I'm done, and it's not laborious. And so I feel like horror, not all horror, but the kind of horror I enjoy tends to be that way, and it's a great way to escape. But also, I like the examination of fear. I think fear is something that we all experience on some level, and even though our fears may not be monsters and dinosaurs, we still it's something we can relate to. And I think that horror at its best is examining fear. Uh, even if what you're looking at is the external, it's a mirror of what we kind of experience internally. And so I really like it for that reason. I think that's why readers like it as well. Um, I think the best horror doesn't scare you as much as it chills you, kind of. And that's something that's great about literature versus movies is that there's no jump scares in a book. You can't. That's not really a paradigm you can use. So you really have to get in to kind of seep into people's imaginations for horror to be effective in literature.
how do you find your stride when you're pacing that book then? If you, like you said, you can't get the jump scare, you don't get the movie music cue. How how do you feel your way into timing the book?
Well, first of all, probably a whole lot of editing. That's definitely something you do in the editing process. I find that for my books, especially, and I really think most good books, they have an element of mystery. It's not very fun to read a book that you know exactly what's going to happen from the beginning. So, in a lot of ways, even in horror, I try to lay out a mystery. I make sure there's something that the reader needs to find out, and that helps me kind of lay the groundwork of how I move through the story and when I hit certain beats. Um, and I'm what they call a pantser, so I sit down and I write. I don't have an outline usually, so that definitely means there's a lot of editing done on the other end. But I have the way that I do it personally is I leave myself tons of clues. So on first draft, I just have like there's a tractor over there and there's a pair of scissors there, and then later I reread it and I'm like, oh, my protagonist needs a weapon. There's a pair of scissors. Great. And I think that has really helped to kind of bring it together, so you don't ever feel like, oh, that came out of nowhere. That's an important part of any book, I think.
Very cool. Um, and I had a really great question. I lost it. It was off the. Um, So when you start building your story, are you pulling your monsters and your kind of your antagonistic presences? Are you pulling those from folklore? Or are you pulling them from you're like, oh, this would be really cool. What if that happened? Where do you get those?
For this series especially, it's mostly folklore. That was the goal. I was a huge fan, well, I'm still a huge fan, I guess, of cryptids. When I was a kid, I believed 100% that Bigfoot was real. As an adult, I can admit that that's highly unlikely. But I love the mystery of cryptids, and so all of my books kind of, well, that's why I started. Is the first one's kind of Bigfoot-ish, the second one's Kraken, the third one is the Native American Skinwalker, fourth one a little less off of folklore and more off of real life. But yeah, that's usually where I get my monsters from for this series. I don't think that'll be every book I ever write. But and I also wanted to make sure that when I pull these monsters in, it's not just like, okay, here's people fighting Bigfoot. I always want there to be a twist, like, okay, but where did Bigfoot come from, or what's. I think every one of my books has some twist on the story, so that the monsters aren't what you think they are, which I think is kind of a hallmark of the books. And I have actually have my grandmother had Time Life Mysteries of the Unknown. I was looking over there because I have it on my bookshelf. And when she passed away, it's the one thing that I said, like, I want of hers. I want her collection of Time Life Mysteries of the Unknown, and one of those is a cryptid book. So when I need inspiration, sometimes even still, I'll pull that book down and see, like, what are the real monsters out of folklore that people have talked about over the years, and how can I turn that into a fun novel.
Do you find I have adult friends who are absolutely convinced of the paranormal? Do you find that maybe even those of us who are grown up and think we don't believe, somewhere in there there's still the kernel of, but what if?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think even I definitely have a scientific part of my mind that says, okay, yeah, probably there's no Bigfoot, but I want there to be a Bigfoot. I want there to be a Loch Ness monster, and I think on some level we all want that. We want that unexpected. I think one of the reasons I like it is similar to like Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park. Like that's a horror novel at its core, but there's so much wonder and excitement, and I feel like cryptids bring the same thing. Like, okay, yeah, Bigfoot's scary, but also if he existed, like, that would be awesome. Yeah, I think we all have a little bit of that we want it to be real.
Um, so when we say that you examine fear, and I had a friend who, when I asked him why he likes scary movies, he likes to be scared, but he likes to know he's safe. Which these paradoxical thinkings. Do you do you feel that horror has, like, maybe even a psychological benefit, or does it scratch some sort of itch in your psyche?
Yeah, I think that it definitely can. I think there's a number of maybe benefits you could get uh, from reading horror or consuming horror in any way, really movies as well. I think there's that fear while being safe is definitely powerful. I think because it gives us an opportunity to confront fear without, like, fearing for our lives. So I think that's fun. I think it triggers something in your brain, and then you have the logical part of your brain that can say, "Oh, but you don't really need to be worried," and that does create a fun dichotomy, I think. Um, and it and for me, at least, when I read like a really good horror novel or watch a really good horror movie, it can be a really good way to reflect, like I said, on my own fears and how would I react in that situation. And so many good horror novels and movies also, they're not fight. There's a monster there, but that's not what they're fighting. They're fighting an inner demon of some sort, and I think reflecting on that is awesome. And the way that the story kind of can mirror, so there's so much mirroring in good horror where you're mirroring an internal struggle with an external struggle, and I think that that's fun. I think right now also, especially, but always, no matter how bad the world gets, you're not being stalked by an evil monster. So it's a good way to remind yourself the world could get worse, I guess. And I think that it's a good genre for really kind of examining our own vulnerabilities. And I think that in some ways with good horror, you can actually feel like you have been edified in that way. Like, you'll come away from it and you'll be like, okay, well, this has made me understand a vulnerability I had that maybe I didn't realize I had. Maybe I didn't know I was scared of that, or maybe I didn't realize that other people were scared of that. That can even be illuminating, I think, for understanding others.
I know, like, some types of horror, and I'm not a huge horror consumer myself, but my husband is. Um, you kind of have your flavors of horror, and at some point in the especially like the 70s and 80s, we had kind of these morality plays in our horror. Um, and I wonder if you still kind of see some of those undertones in maybe not every flavor of horror, all your 31 Baskin Robbins horror flavors, but do you see that still as a trend in some of the genre?
Yeah, yeah, I definitely do. I think that horror kind of gives you the best way to have a morality tale. I think I hate going back to Michael Crichton, but since he's one of my favorites, like his books were all about morality, usually around science, misusing science. And I think that horror gives you a good way to approach that. I think horror has evolved. I think it's more complex than it used to be. So I think a lot of times the trick is how do you write an entertaining book without making it feel preachy? And that is something you have to be careful of horror, but I think it can be done, and it has been done very well. There are especially, I know we're talking about books right now, but there are especially some amazing horror movies that have come out, like Get Out and Us, which those are both Jordan Peele movies, but that can have this way deeper meaning and at the same time be horror in a classic sense.
Do you feel like s- say you were to sit down and want to write something like that now about y- and I'm rephrasing one of the questions I sent you. I apologize. You've got the kind of civil unrest we have in the United States, you have COVID all around the world. We're seeing civil unrest elsewhere. If you were to sit down and write one of those kind of morality horror, what kind of issues do you think it would bring to the table?
That's a good but possibly dangerous question
Right.
politically, but I think definitely we right now are facing I would say human nature of tribalism, and it has gotten to extreme measures. And I think that could be a great premise for a horror novel about tribalism taken to its extreme. Um, I think we also right now may be seeing from some people that I will not name, but we may be seeing a lot of hubris, which is a really common horror trope to make hubris and that's it's super powerful because some of us are worse than others, but we're all a bit prideful sometimes, and so kind of putting a lens or mirror on pride right now may be another thing that I might pull out of the world. uh but I think, yeah, those are the two things I would definitely pull out of today. That's I think kind of the underpinning of what's so scary right now. I think we might have lost Ginger.
Did we?
I'm
No, she's
here if you
there.
can hear me.
Okay, sorry.
There was a
Yeah,
hiccup, but I'm still here.
great. I think I was basically finished. Yeah, those are the two things I would definitely pull out of today's problems that you could like definitely build a whole novel of. That would be both morality tales and horror.
Kind of going back to genre, your website reviews kind of a smorgasbord of genres as far as movies go. And not that anyone has to watch one type of genre, but what can you pull as a writer from other genres that helps you write a stronger narrative yourself?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I do review. I have a movie review blog, and I've been doing that for as long as you could have blogs. I think this current one's only a few years old, but before that, I had others. And I think if you look through there, you might find that I've reviewed almost no horror movies, which seems crazy. One of that reasons for that is because my wife refuses to watch horror, and so do my friends. So I either have to watch it by myself or not at all. Um, but the other reason is I think that for horror to be its best, I actually need to be consuming story that isn't horror, because the one thing I don't want to do is rewrite a horror book that you can already read. So I think that getting a broader look is definitely helpful. One of the things that I like about movies, um, especially lately, they've been very popular movies like the Marvel movies, um, is yeah, they're action, but they're also very adventure-y. And I like adventures a lot. And I think that we tend to think of adventures as like Lord of the Rings, this like really laborious fantasy based setting. And I don't, adventure doesn't have to be that way. And I think a little dash of adventure in everything just makes it better. And that's why, I mean, that's part of my books as well. Like I said earlier, they're kind of, that's their secondary, I think, category on Amazon is action adventure. So I'm especially keen on those movies. The horror movies that I write, I watch rather, usually I don't review them and I watch them alone at home while my wife is at work and call it research. So
So if I were to ask you for titles or directors even, who would you throw out and kind of what draws you to those?
not in horror, outside of horror.
Well, I was thinking in horror, but either
Oh,
really.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, for directors, I've already mentioned Jordan Peele. He's doing amazing stuff in his horror movies. And really, like it is a from the movie perspective, which I think indirectly helps out the genre in writing in literature, is that horror is kind of in a renaissance right now. You've got the Blumhouse guys who are like pumping out horror movies right and left, and they're generally doing a pretty good job on a low budget, which is makes it so that horror movies are one of the only movies you can get new right now. They're coming out pretty regularly on streaming services and stuff. So while we can't watch them in the theater, we can watch them there. I don't have directors, but I would say that most of the stuff that Blumhouse puts out is amazing, and I really like movies. Also, there are some horror movies in the last few years that have really kind of blended genres. So Happy Death Day, and it has a sequel, Happy Death Day to You, I think is the sequel. That is an amazing horror movie that I think anybody should watch. It is time travel mixed with horror, and it is not terribly. It's funny, but also scary. And I love mixing genre. Humor and horror together is great. Joss Whedon has done. I forgot the name of his movie, but he did a horror movie that was kind of like the same thing, like a balance between horror and humor. And that's something I really like in movies that I have a hard time capturing in books. I would love for my books to be more humorous, but it's actually hard to write a horror comedy in book form. Maybe one day I'll try really hard and figure it out. But one author who does that actually pretty well is Grady Hendrix. So he's a horror author who wrote My Best Friend's Exorcism and Horror Store, which is basically a haunted IKEA. And he's got some good stuff, and I really admire that ability to kind of keep it light but also scary.
it doesn't. You say that, and I wonder how you would keep that from kind of falling like mysteries have the cozy mystery. You couldn't possibly have the cozy horror. But
Yeah,
when you say light, I go to like the Cat Who or you know, the mystery books where someone definitely dies horribly, but there's a cat. You know?
right. Yeah, yeah. There's a little bit of one of the books I referenced earlier, The Twisted Ones by T. Kingfisher, is kind of like that. There's a dog that is a main character in the book, and you get to the point where like you're so worried about that dog that you don't care about the monsters or the protagonists. You want to make sure that dog's okay, and it does lighten the mood. I think it tends to make it not feel so bad, and I think I think one thing that horror can do, not all horror does by any means, but horror can do is it can give you hope. I think a lot of horror novels, the good guys win in the end. All of mine are definitely that way. And I think that watching someone overcome and beat fear in whatever form it's presented can give you hope. And so I think I forgot what the question was, but that's where I ended up. Hope.
That's fair. Which brings to mind, in my mind, I know one of my hobbies is I play tabletop role playing games, and very unexpectedly, um, Dungeons and Dragons and games like it have started to be used for things like treating PTSD. Can you see perhaps a role like that for horror for people who kind of need this exposure to help them overcome a thing?
Wow, that's a good question. I think maybe. I think you would definitely have to be careful not to trigger anyone, and that's something that is I have to keep in mind anytime I'm writing a book. My most recent book, The Haunted Hog Run, deals pretty heavily with one of the characters with depression and PTSD and suicidal thoughts, and it is hard to write that in a way that isn't triggering. And I think that if you can do it, it can, I think it can be done. I think that a lot of overcoming a lot of fears. I think exposure therapy, that's a thing for certain kinds of mental health problems where you just kind of need to be slowly exposed to something. So I think being able to read it when you know that the only thing in your way is paper could definitely help. I wouldn't want to be the one to administer it. I think we should definitely bring in a doctor for something like that. But there's definitely the possibility, I think.
So when you wrote those characters, when you wrote those plots and those subplots, did you do a deep dive into research? Did you go speak with someone? How do you approach those subjects?
Yeah, that's also a good question. I think a lot of it, to be completely frank and vulnerable, a lot of it comes from my own experiences. Just what my characters may experience it in a more exaggerated way than me, but that's kind of the nature of the genre. In some cases, I did talk to people. I have one reader, especially a beta reader, who is really good. She's a really great sensitivity reader. And so she is very, very good at pointing out like this is a little too harsh or this doesn't really feel like reality. Um, and whenever I can, I want to bring in those people because I can't know everything. And especially my protagonists are primarily women, and I'm not a woman. So that is something that I have to also be cognizant of. They take place in Texas, so I have some Hispanic characters. Again, I am not Hispanic, so I have to be cognizant of all of that, and I think that that's super important. It's a little bit daunting, but I think that representation is so important that it's worth the effort. And yeah, I do have to find those people, and I do have to maybe go through some extra editing passes to cover everything. But I think it's worth it in the end, especially when you're representing real life. I had all my books are set in Texas so far, and it wasn't until the third book that I had a protagonist that was Hispanic, and that, quite frankly, is tragic. Like I have no excuse for that. If you have a book set in Texas, it's silly not to have an Hispanic character because you're trying to represent real life, and that's the demographics of Texas. So that's something I'm really careful about, and that you do have to be careful about, but it's worth it. It's worth the effort for sure.
Do you find when I spoke with Mary Rowan last month, who's also with your publishing house, and I'm married to William Galaney, who's also with your publishing house. Kind of the common theme I seem to be finding with my author friends and author family is that, like you said, you draw heavily from your experiences, but it also seems to help process some of that. Mary processed the death of her father. My husband processed some of the toxic relationships in his family. Do you find that to be relatively true for you?
Oh yeah, that's absolutely true. I have the experience of not realizing that that's what I was doing till I had finished the book. I think I can't imagine writing a book and not processing something. It's not always super serious. Sometimes it's a small thing, but absolutely it is a good way to process just whatever you're thinking. One of my second book, The Kraken of Cape Madre, not one of my, the protagonists' uh, journey is really about whether or not you have to do the things you were taught or whether you can be who you want to be or who you feel like being, and kind of learning to distinguish between the two. And so I feel like there's so many things that we process and we don't realize we do. And when you're writing, it comes out. And by the time I finished that book, I was like, oh, I see this journey for her and how hard it is for all of us to know, like, is this something I was programmed with? Like, is this something I was taught growing up, or is this something my environment taught me, or is this what I believe? And there comes a point in all of our lives, and I think maybe I've been going through that in the last few years, where we have to answer those questions. And that's why I'm an author now and not a software engineer. Because at some point I had to say, is money more important, or is being happy and like chasing my passion more important? And so that's an example of how I've used my books to process. But yeah, I think I can't imagine writing a book where I'm not processing some thought that I have.
That's awesome. So how did you come to the point where you're like, this is it? I have another friend who recently was like, I'm a potter and an author, and this is my job. How did you come to that? Like, this is time.
Oh, it was a little bit scary. I'll be honest. I'm lucky in a few ways. My wife is also a software engineer, so she is my sugar mama right now. Especially at the beginning, more so even. And it had come to the point where I was about to switch jobs anyway. I kind of hit a dead end at my job, and I wanted to go to a new one. And it had by luck, I guess you could call it luck. There had been a layoff at my company a couple of years before, and they laid me off. And it was frankly pretty devastating. I had never been laid off or fired before, and it was temporary. They ended up bringing me back on, so I was only out of work for a few months. But during that time, I was like, well, I got time. I'm going to write a novel. I've always wanted to do it. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to do it now. And so I started to write a novel, and that's really what got the itch back. So when I did go back to work, from then on, it was like, well, I don't really want to be doing this. I want to go back to writing the novel. That was better. So when I was already looking to switch jobs, my wife said, you should just do it. Like, just quit this job and write a novel. And then when you're done writing the novel, you go back to work. And then you can try to get it published while you're working. So that's what I did. And I got enough traction pretty soon after I wrote that first book that it became a permanent thing. And I got my publisher a little less than a year after that, and have been with them ever since, writing books as quickly as I can. But I certainly do not regret it at all, and I don't miss computer engineering or software engineering one bit. And I hope that I can keep writing forever. Hopefully, people keep buying my books.
That's awesome. So your number 4 in your Lorestalker series came out last month. Tell us about the series. Tell us about your books.
Sure. Yeah. So all my books take place in Texas. There are 4 right now. There are going to be 6. It is a planned 6-book series. So the 5th book will come out next year, and the 6th book will probably come out the year after, unless I really get on the ball. And as I mentioned before, they all are based around cryptids and folklore. The first one, when I first sat down to write a novel, I didn't know what I was doing really. I'd never written like an adult novel. I just mostly written short stories. And if you go out and you research this, one of the things that people will tell you is write what you know. So I said, great, I'm going to set my first book in my hometown because that'll make it easy. And so I did. It's a fictional version of my hometown, and some people in my hometown may take exception to my characterization of it. But so it is and that really set the tone for the whole story, where it's these pretty small, intimate stories about characters, and yeah, they find themselves in situations fighting monsters. And the first one is kind of like the soul of a town is at stake. And then after that, one of my minor characters spirals out on her own, and she's the protagonist of books 2 and 3, where she's her dad was a monster hunter, and it's really about her coming to terms with the fact that she is a good monster hunter because that's what she was raised to be. And does she want to be it? Does she not want to be it? And of course, she has to fight monsters because they're there, and she's the one who can. So that's what books 2 and 3 are. And then book 4, the one that just came out, The Haunted Hog Run, is kind of my take on survival horror. It takes place over the course of one night. It's another character who's been in the other books but wasn't the main character, and she doesn't have the resume of Miriam, who's the monster hunter, but she is put in an extraordinary situation where she is out of communication and has no defense and has to survive a horrible night. And I really like to do that, to kind of jump into different horror genres within it. Every book is a standalone book. You could jump in anywhere you wanted in the series. They all have a beginning, middle, and end. There's no cliffhangers between books. So you can jump in kind of anywhere you want, but they all tie together. And book 5 is the one I'm working on now. That's called The Devil of Misty Lake. and it'll be the first one outside of Texas. I'm going to Washington State, which is where my wife is from. So I've been there a few times, and it's also the famed home of the original Bigfoot. So it seems like they deserve to be in a book. And then for the sixth book is going to be called The Legacy of Rose Valley. So the first one's The Beast of Rose Valley. The last one will be The Legacy of Rose Valley. And my plans for that book right now are to jump the shark as hard as I can. I'm going to pull in every loose thread from every book and every character that I can cram in there and just make them all fight. Basically, that's my plan. Hopefully, it works out. It sounds like a bad idea right now, I realize, but I think I can make it work.
It's your end game.
That's right. That's right.
That's awesome. I'm gonna, if it's okay with you, I'm gonna open up the floor for questions if you guys want. If you guys want to unmute yourself and throw some questions our way. Maybe or maybe we hit everything.
Sure. I'll start us off here.
Sure.
So I wanted to ask, so you mentioned that you're a pantser. Have you always been a pantser, and have you seen your writing process change over the years?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, I think I've always been a pantser. When I started writing, I didn't know there was any other way. So, like when I started as a kid, no one tells you in second grade that you should outline your story before you write it. So I didn't know to do that. And for my short stories, I was always that way. And I started so many novels. My wife, when I finally did sit down to finally finish one, she was like, "I'm so glad you're finally finishing a novel. I've read like the first part of so many novels." And so I didn't really know going into it whether that was going to work, not having a plot outline. But it did. And so I just kept doing it. The book that I'm writing right now is the first one that I have an outline for. I have tried outlining one book before. After I wrote my first book and I didn't know whether it was going to get published, I started another book in a different genre. It's actually science fiction. And I outlined the whole thing and I got bored with it. I was like, well, I know what's going to happen, so I don't want to write it. And I think that that's the risk for someone like me is if I over outline it, then I feel like I've already written the story. And for me, it's actually fun to find out. Like I get to sit down every day and be like, what's going to happen today? I don't know. The characters tell me and the story tells me. And that's a much more fun way to write. I hope it also produces books that people want to read, but it's definitely a much more fun way to write for me.
I guess I'll go next.
Sure.
What do you feel the hardest part of writing actually is in your day-to-day, adventures of writing?
The simplest one, which is to do it. It is so easy to not write. And you would think that during a global pandemic, when we barely leave the house, it would be easy. You'd think you just like, oh, I got tons of time on my hand. What else am I going to do? But no, it's been harder right now than any other time. And, writing is something that takes a lot of focus. And when you've got a lot of distractions, whether they're directly competing for your attention or they're more like on the fringes, like, living through a global pandemic is, it can make it hard to write. So the hardest part is definitely just sitting down and doing it. Once I do sit down and kind of get in the groove, it usually comes pretty fast. I can write pretty quick when I'm focused. My first book only took me about 2 months to write. And the others have taken about 4 or 5. And so the problem is always just do it. And I know that there are people who will tell you like write every day, and that might work for some people, but I definitely need breaks. When I finished the second book, The Kraken of Cape Madre, I went directly into the third one because the publisher was like, if you get your first 3 books out, you'll do better. So you need to get it out. And I was like, yeah, I wanted to, I wanted to know as quickly as possible. I'm not saying they're slave drivers or anything. They didn't force me to do that, but I went straight into it, and my creative mind wasn't ready for it, and I could tell. And writing that whole book was a fight. I fought that book till the very end, and I think it turned out well. But I'm definitely someone who needs breaks between books, so it's always hard for me to be like, am I taking a break or am I being lazy? Like where's the line there? I'm not real sure. Right now, I think I'm starting to get into being lazy though, so I need to get to work on book 5.
Does seem like current events has taken a toll on a lot of the creatives I know, though.
Yeah, I don't know if it's something about being a creative that makes you just. I feel like the worries of the world are mine personally sometimes, and I don't know if it's over empathy or just pure anxiety and worry, but there's so much uncertainty, and I think for me, especially when I don't know what's going to happen, it's hard to focus on anything else except for what's going to happen. And right now, there's so much that I have no control over, that none of us have any control over, except for wearing a mask. You should wear a mask. And you know that's scary. And even if it's not directly affecting you every day, it definitely takes a toll. And I don't know if that's for everybody, but I definitely is the case for me.
Hey JP, I have a question, a couple questions actually, and forgive me, I've got some background noise in the house here with the family, so sorry if any of that bleeds through. Number one, you mentioned earlier in the talk that you have a lot of focus on female characters in your books, and we can see that when we read them. What First question is, what do you think it is that drives you, or to be drawn towards writing from a female perspective and making them the heroine of your books? And then the second question is about the speed at which the books have come out, because you were talking about, you know, kind of feeling like you were being lazy, but I felt like they were very rapidly coming out. I mean, compared to some other authors that I read, and I have to sit and twiddle my thumbs. Some with also acronyms for their first name and TV shows about their books. But anyway, I just feel like you're going very fast. But also, I thought the books have tied together quite well, which I was, no offense, surprised at because of how rapidly they came out. So I'm just curious about those two things.
Thanks. Yeah. So the first thing, as far as female protagonists go, I think mostly it's because I'm a bad man, in terms of I'm not the most masculine man, but also I don't. Other than my own perspective as being a male, all of the examples of my life were female. I was raised by a single mom. I've got a sister. It is a very matriarchal family, and so all I ever saw my whole life was you want something done, you ask the women to do it. And if you want to see someone just flounder and not do anything good, then ask the man. So I think that's part of why I was drawn to that, because it's just what I know. Like you write what you know, and I have so many examples of strong women in my life that it seems silly not to write about that. And I am also fortunate that I married a very strong woman in my wife. So like I've always been surrounded by very strong women, and I think again representation matters, and I get the fact that I'm a white male author and that a horror author no less, which is not exactly novel. So the least I can do also is just kind of get some more representation in there, and I feel like that's a voice that I have the knowledge to tackle, number one, but number two, I am surrounded by enough people that will tell me if I get it wrong. And so it's something I can kind of safely do. As far as speed goes, yeah, I think on an absolute scale, my books have come out fairly quickly. I think my first book came out did it just come out last year? It did. So my first book came out last year. So 3 books last year, 1 book this year is the rate. So I guess that's 2 books a year on average right now, which is pretty fast. I definitely I feel like I'm slowing down. So I think part of me saying I'm lazy is, well, I'm not writing as fast as I used to. And so it's just kind of a little bit of self-reflection in that regard. And as far as them tying together while writing them, I would think the books are easier to tie together when you write them fast. I've never written them so I don't know. Like I don't know, for example, how the author you mentioned could write a huge epic fantasy like that and keep it straight in his head at all, even remotely. Like who's even alive anymore? I don't even know, and I only have to read it. I can't imagine. So I think writing it faster actually helps to keep everything together. I would, if I could release 3 books a year, I totally would. But I've learned that my creative tank hits empty, and though I can put words on a paper, they won't be words you and I want to read. And the amount of editing that goes into that makes it's not really a cost-effective thing to do. So I do have to take breaks, but I'm hoping I can keep up the speed of at least 1 book a year. I would like it to be 2 or maybe 2 or 3 every 2 years if I could. But we'll see how it goes. I might start writing more. I think my books aren't overly complex, so that helps. If I was writing something like Game of Thrones, it would obviously be a lot more complexity to keep up with, and I think that would slow me down quite a bit. That's one of the reasons I'll never write fantasy. I don't have the patience to create this whole world and keep it straight in my head.
Well, I appreciate the thoughtful answer. I do have one follow up. Do you foresee, it doesn't sound like, based on the outline you talked about for books 5 and 6, that we're going to have a really male protagonist at the forefront in this series. Is there something kind of in the back of your head for that, whatever that next thing is, where you might pivot to that, or you anticipate sort of sticking with the female protagonist for a while?
It's a good question. I don't have a strong opinion on that. I think it will definitely come with the story. I think that book 6 of this series will be a pretty balanced view. The first book was more there was kind of co-protagonists, one male, one female, and I think the 6th book will be more like that, more of a balance. As far as I do have my next book or my next series after this kind of in my head, but I don't really know at this point who the protagonist will be. I'll kind of go with that when I write it. I would say at this point I'm pretty comfortable writing the protagonist that I do, so there's probably a good likelihood I'll stick with it just because it's kind of what I'm comfortable with. I don't know if inherent in your question is I don't know if having female protagonist or male protagonist, either one, alienates a certain group of readers if they feel like they can't connect with the characters as much. And I don't know if that's a thing or not. It's not something people have talked to me about, but something to keep in mind, I guess, on my end.
No, that definitely wasn't the perspective. It was just maybe it's just some of what I'm used to reading, and to your point about representation, right? Thank you, appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
I just have a behind the scenes kind of comment as the author's wife about female protagonists. The first book, Jake is the main character, but subconsciously, like I think Josh realized it, or JP realized Jake wasn't getting it done, and so Shandy shows up on the scene, and kind of like she's the really driving force there. So I think that he didn't intend for it to be the voice, to have the voice be a female protagonist, but I think that it just kind of happened because of the experiences that he's had in his life, that he was like, wait, we need to get this taken care of. Oh, I know. Let's bring. So that's just kind of a behind the scenes kind of look at his protagonist.
Yeah, that's definitely an insightful point. That's definitely how the first book went down. The main character is nominally Jake, who is a male, and he's not. If you finish the whole book, and I didn't realize this after I finished it, he doesn't really do much. He's kind of useless. It's really Shandy who steps in and does all the hard work and is the real power behind driving the plot. And so I think she's kind of the hidden protagonist, really. And it's no coincidence, probably, that Shandy is a fiery redhead, as Akemi said, because my family all redheads. So I got plenty of those to draw inspiration from.
It's awesome. Does anyone else?
Cabin in the Woods.
Yes, Cabin in the Woods. That is the Joss Whedon horror movie. It has Thor in it, Chris Hemsworth in it, and he is hilarious. I definitely recommend that movie. It's very meta. It's not very scary. I don't think it's very scary. I think it's funnier than it is scary. But yeah, I definitely recommend that movie to anyone who hasn't seen it.
Actually, can I ask about your covers?
Yes. Do you have a specific question?
Yeah. As far as the art style it goes, it reminds me a bit of the classic Choose Your Own Adventure books. And with that, even though I know that horror, of course, is a genre, especially of your fourth cover, it has a very strong adventure vibe to it. Now, how did you go about commissioning the art, or, pursuing what imagery you wanted on the cover in order to entice the reader without giving anything away, etc.? And we can start with the first book. All four of them I'm really interested in.
Yeah, sure. Actually, I conveniently made sure that they were nearby so I could show them to people as we go. So one of the things that I wanted to go for, and I knew from the beginning, is I kind of like the old school. Like if you look at the movies, when I was a kid, sorry, I keep restarting my sentence. When I was a kid, UPN, I think, was the channel. Like on Halloween, they would show all those black and white horror movies, like Dracula and the Wolfman and all of that. And if you ever go look at those movie posters, which you might never do, because why would you? They have a very unique vibe, like this very like creature feature. And that is, I think all of my books are labeled like a creature feature horror suspense by J.P. Barnett. So I definitely wanted to capture kind of that creature feature vibe in the books. And so when I was working with my artist, that was on the front of my mind. And it was important to me to have original art done rather than just clip art, which is a lot of how a lot of covers get done. So and yeah, it is tricky to give you enough to know, like, okay, there's a town and there's something big and scary, but what is it? And I have been told that this one looks a little bit too much like a romance novel. So there's that. Sometimes you miss it.
That might have played into your favor.
That's true. That's true. It may have. There's light romance in the book.
I'm sure there'll be fan fiction based on it.
I hope so. That would be the highest compliment. So yeah, this one, I'm especially like this one though, because this down here, which is the town of Rose Valley, it is literally based on a photograph from my hometown, almost identical. So I was proud of that. And so I feel like this one actually went a little too in your face as far as telling you more about maybe the plot than I might want. So I really liked this one, as you can see, there are tentacles. And again, it's kind of, I like this one so much because it is a mixture of calmness and fear. Like you look at it and you're like, oh, it's the ocean. That's nice and relaxing. And then, oh, wait, there's like really scary tentacles and they're going to pull down the pier or something. So I really like that this one's kind of a 1-2 punch. I think when you look at it the first time, you might not even notice the tentacles. And again, I think that captures that creature feature kind of thing. The third one, I think it's probably the most striking of the covers.
Yeah, that's my favorite. I love that one.
Yeah, I really like this cover too. This was mostly the cover artist's idea. I was like, well, it takes place in the desert, and, deserts have skulls, so I wanted it to be some kind of creepy skull thing. And he was like, well, what if I put them all together into a chimera of skulls? And so that was his idea. And because of that, I wrote that into the story. So those are actually prominent in the story. And he just did an amazing job of that. I think this cover catches the eye really well. And last one that you mentioned, definitely, I see what you're saying about it looks like an adventure book. And you've got somebody running away from something and they're in the woods. And I hadn't thought of it that way before as an adventure book, but as I mentioned earlier, adventure is a big part of what I want my books to be. I think I want you to go on an adventure with my characters. And even though it may be technically horror, I don't think it's a bad thing to let you know that there's going to be this adventure. This is the first one we put one of the protagonists on the cover. I guess technically there was a character on this, but it's the monster. And so there was that's a fun process to go with the artist to, I think when he first drew it, she had the wrong color hair and she was wearing clothes that I thought she would never wear. And it's a fun process because, most people don't realize cover artists don't read your book. They don't have time for that. They've got too many covers to do. So it's a lot of back and forth, and it's a really good exercise in boiling down my story in a way that he could read in a couple of sentences. And I think his name is Richard Tran, the cover artist for all of my books. And I think he's done an amazing job of taking like the vibe and just boiling it down to what I want. He also hides things in it. I don't want to give some of them away, but this one especially has some hidden imagery which hints at the plot that isn't obvious. It was more obvious earlier incarnations. And he's working on the 5th cover right now, and again, it's called The Devil of Misty Lake. And so this idea of like looking up from underneath the waters is kind of what we're playing with right now, and I think that's going to be another kind of creature feature. I think ominous might be the right word. Like I think my covers tend towards being ominous, which I like.
Awesome. Is anyone else have a question?
I was going to say I had cut out briefly for a minute, so I apologize if this was already asked, but you had mentioned you had kind of some seeds for a future series. Is this something that is this series gonna remain in the horror type genre, or is it a different type of genre you're going with?
That's a good question. I would love to write science fiction one day, but I think that there's value just from a pure logistical and economical perspective. It makes sense to stay in horror for a little while since I've got a fan base there. So I think the next series will definitely be horror. Right now, just sneak peek for everybody. The tentative title of that book is called Outer Demons, and it's going to kind of go into more like demonology and exorcisms and kind of my comps is I say it's a mix of like Good Omens and The Exorcist like mixed together. So it's going to be a little. I'm hoping to make it a little bit more whimsical, just because that's something that I love. I love that kind of whimsical horror. So I'm hoping it'll go there, but it's going to be a few years before I can seriously start writing that. So we'll see what happens.
All right. I'm going to put out kind of the last call to the floor. Does anyone have a question? All righty. I want to thank you all so much for joining us tonight. JP, did you want to close with anything special, or I have a slide with all of your websites on it here.
Perfect.
As soon as I can pull that up.
Yeah, I would just say thanks everybody for coming. This is the first time I've done like a live interview, and you can ask my wife. I've been terrified for days. So hopefully it went okay. I think I remember how to talk to humans. We do so much less interaction now than usual, especially us authors. We don't have coworkers, so it's me and my cat all day mostly. So thanks everybody for coming, and thanks for the questions. They were all great questions.
Awesome. Can you all see the slide, or should I make it bigger for you?
Yes, we can see it, but I think your participant screen is obscuring part of it. You might have to move that out of the way, or yeah, that one. Yeah,
Better?
perfect.
Oh, that is the slide.
Perfect.
I'll tell you something else weird about coming from software engineer to being an author. Seeing your face is so weird. Like when your face is like the whole slide, super awkward.
Awesome. So for those of you who joined us maybe a few minutes late, I did record the session. We will post it to the Prince William Public Library's YouTube page, probably sometime around lunchtime tomorrow, because that's when Rachel does her best work. Thank you, JP, so much for joining us tonight. If you are local to me in Prince William County, Virginia, we have copies of JP's books in the library. If not, you can see his links here. You can get them on Amazon, Kindle Unlimited. Any bookstore should be able to special order it for you through Ingram. I'm going to stop sharing so that I can properly this, maybe. I've done this a lot, but not enough to really have the hang of this. Stop sharing. There we go. And thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, JP.
Yeah, thanks for having me.